The Lamb Jewish Library of Australia would like to thank you for attending tonight's author talk with Ashley Browne in conversation with Daniel Cherny. My name is Lauren Joffe and I am the Library Director. I'm delighted to see you all here this evening. On behalf of the Library Chairperson, Dr. Roline Lamb, I would like to extend a warm welcome to you all, and in particular to our author Ashley and Daniel. Welcome to you both. For those who are not familiar with our library, we are a major Jewish information resource center with titles in English, Hebrew, and Yiddish. We have an extensive ebook collection, which is very easy to use. The Write Your Story program has published over 140 memoirs, and we are probably the largest publisher of Holocaust memoirs in English in the world. We run an interesting program of events, including author talks, lectures, discussions, children's programs, and a book club. For more information on upcoming events, please check our website, Facebook, and Instagram. We look forward to seeing you all in the library. Ashley Browne has written about AFL football for about 30 years. He spent 10 years with The Age and enjoyed 2 stints with afl.com.au as managing editor and later as a senior writer. Since 2012, he's been the senior writer for the AFL Record at AFL Media, and since 2019 at Croc Media, where his work also features on various radio platforms. He has edited and contributed to several football books for Slattery Media, and in 2018, he was the joint editor of People of the Boot, The Triumphs and Tragedy of Australian Jews in Sport. His book, A Season Like No Other, AFL 220, is an exploration of how the AFL, as both our national sport and as an organization, navigated a season that changed day by day for fans, for the clubs, for the players, and the coaches. It was a season rife with speculation, confusion about whether it could or even would proceed, and where the word hubs became a key word, not just for the AFL, but for sports organizations all around the world. Our interviewer, Daniel Cherny, is a sports journalist at The Age. He has worked on TV and radio and has been involved in cricket, AFL, and other sports. After the interview, Joey Wilkinson will pass any questions you may have to Ashley and Daniel. Ian Samuel will conclude our event. Please add any questions you have to the chat box during the conversation. Thank you, Joey, for managing tonight's event. Daniel, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lauren. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to you, Ashley, or to hear from you. I suppose, first of all, tell us about this book. How did it come about? What was the genesis of it for you?
So I was only working a couple of days a week by this stage last year. Like a lot of people in football, I didn't work at all. I stood down from my role with the AFL Record when the season was shut down. And it occurred to me that over the course of that time, that so much was happening that there'd be a great book somewhere. And I sort of regretted not taking daily notes, just for a few minutes every day, to capture the events of the day. As you know, Daniel, there was news happening every day and often major decisions being made, even when there was no football being played. But on the late July, I got an email from Jeff Slattery, a former boss of mine, who at Slattery Media, who said, no one's writing the book. I think it needs to be written. Do you have capacity to write a book about the season? And I didn't even finish the email without responding, thinking this is the book I want to write. I mean, it's the most remarkable historic season ever played. And so I got to work straight then. So that's how it happened. I mean, as I said, if I'd had the wherewithal, I probably would have started writing it myself a few months earlier. But I just thought one of our many colleagues in the media would be doing it. There was no shortage of stuff happening and people were covering it who were across it every day. So when it was clear there was no one doing it and it was an important book that needed to be written, I sort of jumped at the opportunity.
You'd edited the book before, People of the Boot, but you'd never written one like this. Was it something you'd always been keen to do?
Yeah, I mean, I've always wanted to write a book from start to finish and have tremendous admiration for colleagues and friends who've done it. It's a huge job, and even more so for the people who write books while holding down either other jobs in media or other jobs. It's a huge undertaking. I mean, I was in a fortunate position where I was working either part-time or not at all for the time I wrote, for the 4 or 5 months I worked on the book. I didn't have a whole lot else going on for a lot of it. So, but yeah, it was a dream to write the book from start to finish. As I said, I've edited books and contributed to a lot of books, bits and pieces, and in some cases, lots of books, big parts of them. But so it was a real challenge to do it from start to finish.
So once you commit to doing something like this, where do you begin? What's your process in terms of planning out who you're going to talk to, what the chapters look like? Given at this point that you committed to it, it was still an unfolding situation. How did you choose the way you were going to go about it?
Well, I worked through a timeline. So got a timeline together of the key events starting back from January and when the pandemic first sort of came to Australia and started to affect the first conversation with regards to the AFL were sort of in February, I guess. So I worked out a timeline of the key events, and Google is very helpful, extremely helpful with that to help me put all that together. I had to weigh up how I was going to write it. There was one way of doing it was I was just going to do, in fact, my initial thought, I actually wrote the first 3 or 4 chapters this way. It was a chapter on grassroots football, a chapter on this, a chapter on that, but not chronological. But as I was doing that, I thought, I think it's going to work better as a chronological narrative, picking up the story from as the book explains, from a phone call that the chairman of the AFL gave to the chief executive of the AFL in January, and working way through till, as it turned out, we were still putting content in early January of this year, the last couple of notes. So I just thought in there to work better as a chronological tale. So the structure was using my background as a journalist, because I didn't have a lot of time, really. I mean, 5 months is not a lot of time to write. It was 80,000 words in the end. It's almost a series of feature stories in chronological order, one leading to the next, each chapter leading to the next, with a couple that stand out on their own. By and large, it's a series of feature stories.
And when you're actually deciding, where you're going to draw the line with various chapters, how hard is that process? And what were the hardest decisions you had to make when you're making these calls?
Oh, well, I had real freedom to structure it as I wanted to. It's more about what story would fit where. And occasionally in the narrative, you have to jump forward or skip back in order to tell the stories properly. It was more a couple of, as what I get to, in the end, the AFL came to the party with the book and provided great assistance. But the caveat with the AFL getting involved was a couple of things I had to leave out, I guess, and a couple of things that they didn't particularly want to see in the book. And that was part of it as well, working out, we can't go into that area. But there was a lot to cover off. So much happened over the course of the year. I was leaving stuff out because the brief was for 60,000 words and I got it to 80,000 words and thought we'd have to do this huge cut. But in the end, the publishers were just happy with the way it was and says, we'll take the extra words. So there were no real decisions weren't huge chunks of the narrative that had to be left out in the end.
So initially, were you not expecting the AFL to come to the party?
Well, we were reasonably confident because Jeff Slattery's got a close relationship with the AFL, but we needed their support to get on board. I didn't have access to most of the key players there, it would have been harder to tell the story. And there's an argument in the publishing that if you can slap the AFL logo on it, then it's going to be seen as more people are going to buy it. I don't know if it's true or not. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with that idea, but once they came on board, the access to key staffers and their key people became easier as well. So that was a real reason, a key reason why the book turned out the way it did. And
you can't shed any light on the things you had to leave out? Or give us any hints?
Just a few episodes around. A few things happened in the hubs. And the hubs was such a big part of the story in football last year. A few things happened in the hubs that were left out. Some were publicised, some they just didn't want a lot of attention given to. A couple of things I learned subsequently. It's interesting, when I was writing the book, I said to a few people, are you in the hub? Let's have a chat to you. And they said, I don't really have much to say, or I'll get back to you later. And suddenly the book comes out and it was like, yeah, I should have spoken to you. I had some stories. I had some things I could have told you. So there was a few things that it probably could have added a bit more colour to it all. But yeah, that was probably the part where the stuff that I heard that I could have put in. But also with the hubs, I was worried with the hub chapter that people in the hubs would read it and say, look at all the things you didn't say. That's not what really happened. But if people don't tell you stuff, then you can't write it. I wasn't about to speculate and make stuff up.
How many people did you end up talking to for the book? And other than, I suppose, the AFL? Did you have to twist many arms, or most were pretty prepared to talk?
Most people are prepared to talk about it. The approach to people was, this is going to be a book that's going to be an immediate look at what happened, and it'll become a bit of a statement of record almost, 10, 20, 50 years down the track. People are going to say, how did football cope with that pandemic in 2020? And this will be the reference material for that. So I probably did about 30 interviews over the course. Some were, really in depth. Others were just quick phone calls, almost fact checking more than anything else. But about 30 interviews all up with people across the game. And I only got 3 knockbacks that I can think of for people who said, no, I don't really want to be part of the book. Everyone else was really keen to be involved. And in fact, I had a couple of people sort of approach me and say, or here you are in this book, I'd really like to talk to you for. I think I've got something to add to it. And so here's my details, get in touch. And that was handy to talk, because this word started to spread over the course of the second half of the year that I was writing the book. And there were people who thought they had stories that should be part of it, and facts that they thought important to be in the book.
Were you surprised that anyone knocked you back, or were you expecting that? And were there some people that were prepared to tell you some stuff on the record and some just as background? I
got a bit of stuff from people's background. People said, don't quote me on this, but this is what happened. Look, I got 3 high. I'm happy to say, 2 of them was, I really want to get Jeff Kennett, because he's such an interesting character, and he just said, just can't be bothered. And the other person was disappointed. I really want to get Daisy Pearce, the AFLW, Melbourne AFLW captain, to talk as well, almost as a figurehead for the women's game. But she just said, look, I'm just not interested, to be honest. I think she probably, between bringing up her twins and extensive media commitments anyway, she probably just didn't have time to do it justice. So, so I cut them. I was disappointed with Jeff, because I think he really would have added a bit of colour to the book. He was so heavily involved in a couple of different areas. Daisy, I managed to get Emma Carney to speak to me, who's a North Melbourne women's captain. She was pretty good, but they were the main 2 who knocked me back.
I suppose you could empathise with anyone having to raise twins. Yes,
I'm well versed in people with twins, so I fully understand.
Was there a favourite interviews that you did? Any that really stick out, or any memorable experiences from the interviews?
Well, the couple that stick out, the firstly was I had a really good chat to John Longmire, the coach of the Swans. He, was suggested to me by Mark Brayshaw, who was then the head of the Coaches Association, said, you should talk to Horse. I think he's got a bit to say. And then he just was terrific, and he just kept talking. He had a really long, detailed conversation, some of the more colourful, interesting quotes, because he comes across sometimes as a very doer character. I mean, when we deal with him on a day-to-day basis, but when you get a chance to have a conversation with him, he's wonderful. And we had a really good chat. And I guess it was a privilege. I mean, the day before the grand final, Gillan McLachlan gave me an hour and a half from his hotel, from his sort of apartment in Brisbane that he was staying in, which, in any other grand final week, he hasn't got 2 minutes to spare. But this was such a different grand final. He said all he wasn't doing much that day. So he was really happy to have the chat the day before the grand final. All he was doing was working on his speech for the function the next day. So again, that was the timing of that was as memorable as much as what he told me, that just have access to this guy so close to the biggest day of the footy year was, and I guess that was was indicative to me that the AFL actually were really supportive of the book and wanted to make sure that the story was presented well and a great story was told.
And I believe the St Kilda captain was quite helpful walking around a local area as well.
Yeah, Jaron Geary, who's a resident of Caulfield. We met up in Mr. Brightside in Burren Road for a coffee one day. That's one of my favourite parts of the book. It hit the human side of it and the player side of it without having to give too much away. He had to make some major decisions around with his wife, who was expecting their second child, about whether he went to the hub and whether she would join him. And that meant he went to Queensland a couple of days before some new restrictions came in, stage 2 or stage 4 restrictions came to Victoria. So suddenly her support network couldn't come to see her because they lived more than 5 k's away. So he's off in Queensland and she's on her own with their two-year-old daughter, 25, 26 weeks pregnant, doing all on her own while he's up in Queensland. And talk about the guilt, players feeling very guilty about being up in Queensland. You can't help after a while but having a good time with your footy mates in Queensland, and the personal toll it took a lot of people is part of the book as well.
Was there a favourite chapter you had in the end, or was there a part of the book that you're particularly proud of, other than the whole thing clearly, but anything in particular?
Well, it was wonderful to recount that. I mean, Richard Goyder, who's the chairman of the AFL, who's also chairman of Qantas and Woodside and one of Australia's leading businessmen. He was one of the people that was really keen to be interviewed because he thought he had some stuff he wanted to add. I mean, to be able to be sort of him recount the conversation that he had with Alan Joyce, who was the chief executive of Qantas. This is in the very first chapter. You know, Qantas was one of the first Australian institutions or businesses to understand that there was something happening in China that could be quite serious. For him to relay that conversation he had with me, that he had with Alan Joyce at Qantas, and then he picked up the phone immediately and rang Gillon McLachlan. So I really enjoyed writing, painting the picture pretty much from the first couple of pages. The other one that interests me, because this kind of junkie in these sorts of things, I really enjoyed writing the chapter comparing the NRL to the AFL. Peter V'landys, who's the chairman the chairman of the National Rugby League, the Australian Rugby League Commission, is such a unique character in Australian sport. And the way he navigated rugby league through COVID compared to the way Gill navigated the AFL through COVID. And it's a little bit sort of inside baseball, to use the expression that we use. But I really enjoyed writing that chapter. The AFL, one chapter the AFL weren't keen on, actually. They said, well, why does anyone care about what rugby league were doing? But we managed to convince them it was actually a really fundamental part of the story. Because as you would know, Daniel, for a while there was an unofficial competition. Not the AFL entered it necessarily, but the media were keeping competition as which sport would come back first. Rugby league, who really didn't want to come, to them it was a matter of importance that they came back before the AFL. The AFL didn't care so much who came back first, who resumed playing. But I enjoyed writing that chapter.
Did you try to talk to Peter V'landys?
No, because I just didn't have time. So I was able to paint the rugby league picture by talking to some rugby league journo mates of mine, and there was a fair bit already written about V'landys. So I didn't feel I needed to do the interview with him. I suspect, given how his attitude towards anything to do with the AFL, if I'd actually called him and said I'm writing a book, he would have probably said, no, I'm not going to help you anyway. So he's so anti anything to do with the AFL. And I just didn't need to. And I didn't want to have to waste time going through layers of media people that I didn't know to talk to him. I mean, the very, very slight Jewish angle, if there is one to the book, of course, is that Todd Greenberg was the National Rugby League CEO at the time the NRL shut down. But in the time that the game was shut down, Greenberg was sacked or resigned, and depending on who you believe, he wasn't there anymore. And he and the AFL were very close. He and Gillon had a really good working relationship, and that was destroyed pretty much because V'landys just saw the AFL as a competitor with whom you don't cooperate with at all.
Do you think it was you were back in Victoria and didn't go up to the hub? Do you think that made it harder or easier in the end?
To write the book?
Yeah.
A little bit harder, I think. I mean, from talking to some journos, friends of yours, colleagues of yours, with mutual friends who were up there was a level of access you had to key decision makers. You couldn't help but just end up sitting having a coffee or a breakfast with all the power brokers in the game who are up there because you're all living in the same place. So I had that disadvantage of not being up there. A few people sort of helped paint me the picture of what was happening up there. But I think it would have been an easier book to write had I been up there, I think. But I'm pretty pleased with most of the way I was able to paint the picture without being up there. But the hubs in the end that was about 12 weeks at its longest for a few clubs of the season. A lot happened before. There was 3 or 4 or 5 months of activity before they even went to the hub. So it wasn't just all about what happened for those few months.
Can you actually talk through a bit about what happened before?
Sorry, you've dropped out. Sorry, I couldn't hear that.
Internet issues there?
Yeah, I keep saying it again. I just dropped out. Sorry, Daniel.
Oh, sorry about that. Can you talk us through your professional life last year before lockdown and how it went down for you and some of the challenges, what it was like covering footy from your end and how it worked professionally for you?
Yeah, sure. So I'm the senior writer for the AFL Record, working for Croc Media. So I was at the round 1 Hawthorn Brisbane game. I think were you there that day as well? I think at the MCG. the day the season was called off, and even in the media conference that Guild had was at half time of that game. So pretty much as soon as the media conference was finished, I had a very bad feeling about what was going to happen. Then I got a text from my boss in the third quarter, Michael Lovett, saying, "Don't come to work tomorrow. We've got a meeting in the morning, but it's no point in coming. I don't think we're going to be doing a magazine next week." So that was a pretty sick feeling. And then the next morning I found out, like the rest, all but a couple of people on record, I'd been stood down. So I didn't work at all for 2 months, and then just wanted to JobKeeper for some of it, and then came back. The AFL record was still published, but it was just really just two people putting it out, and the editor and a production manager using a lot of old content and a bit of assistance from some of the journalists at SEN, the digital journalists. Then when the footy came back, we did resumed the print edition, which was re-engineered as one edition for every game, one edition for all games, as opposed to a different edition for every game. It was given a big retail focus. For the first time, the record on a weekly basis was sold in shops. So I came back on a 2-day-a-week basis for the rest of the season, except for the finals when there was a bit more to do. I was sort of working a few more days a week through October, which was the final series. But a very different year for me as well. I know a lot of people in the industry were made to take across. A lot of football people weren't stood down, but were told to take some, use up a lot of annual leave and even long service leave in a lot of cases. The journalists are very good at accruing lots of leave, and a lot of that leave was cleared out. Their organisers said, well, there's no games being played, take a month off and get some of your leave off our books. So there's a lot of that going on. So I consider myself fortunate because my previous employer, AFL Media, a lot of the journos there were stood down and didn't come back, and that's happened across the board. So I consider myself fortunate in a lot of ways that, like I had to take a bit of financial hit for a few months, but there was something there for me at the end, which wasn't the case. And a lot of really good football media people have left the industry now because it's just it contracted so much, like so much else of Australian society and Australian business. There's been a big contraction.
And is it right that sort of in that first half of the year between late March and when the season resumed in early to mid-June, that you really just tried to stay away from footy and media and didn't barely consume it at all, which is obviously a big change from your usual habits?
Yeah, I decided to use it as a bit of a mental break from footy. So I basically didn't pay. I got out of the habit of listening to sports radio and watching what was left of the AFL shows on TV, and really just at 5 o'clock every day, I would just sort of log on and sort of give myself half an hour to sort of catch up and use the day, then switch off again. It was a time to exercise and walk the streets of Caulfield like every nook and cranny of Caulfield and surrounding areas, and read and Netflix and the whole thing like a lot of other people, and got a bit healthier. But that was a time when I'd flick on every day and see what had happened over the course of the day. That's what got me thinking initially, which is I hope someone's actually capturing all of this, because there's so much happening that there will be a book in this somewhere by someone, just by that exercise every day of catching up on the news. Because I quite enjoyed the mental break from it all, to be honest, because I'm not one, as much as I love footy, I didn't want to spend my days watching old replays on TV that a lot of my friends did. Fox Footy was just showing replay after replay of old game. To me, that had no interest. So I thought it was actually time to catch up on all those books I've never read and all those movies and TV shows I've never seen. And I really enjoyed doing that. And just parking for the first time. And I took 3 years off footy right to work at the Jewish News, but even then I was still sort of consumed by footy a fair bit. But it's really the first time in 30 years I'd sort of parked the AFL to the side a bit, and I found it sort of quite refreshing.
And once you're actually writing the book and you get into the thick of it, what's that like, and how intense is that process? And I suppose talk through the last few months of 2020 for you.
Yeah, it was pretty. Once I started, I got the phone call on the 25th. I got the email on the 25th of July, and by the 26th, I started sort of planning it out. At its peak, I was doing probably 10 hours a day, 10 to 12 hours a day of writing, and I had to. I was writing in some cases. You go through bursts. Some days you don't write much, other days because you're doing research or transcribing. The worst part of writing the book that I find is transcribing. I was in a position to sort of get someone to do it for me, so just going through, to transcribe 1 hour of audio is often 5-6 hours of work to do it properly. But once I'd done most of the transcribing, I found I was doing, I could churn through sometimes 1,500 to 2,000 words a day, and also knock over it. I was working to a rough plan at one stage of a chapter every day, one chapter every 2 days to plough through it. And some days I'll do even better than that because sometimes you get in a role when you're writing and it just comes to you really quickly. A couple of chapters were a real slog, and they're probably 10, 11-hour days, and I was really just taking a break to do a bit of housework and at least one, good walk a day with Mandy, and that was about it. And make sure it's like anything, make sure you eat well at least once a day. And but it, just disappear into my study and crash it out. But great support from the family, who's realised it was a big project for me to do and left me alone and to do what I needed to do.
Just in terms of the transcribing, did you just transcribe everything first before you went and started writing? And how many hours do you think you actually transcribed of audio?
Well, I haven't worked out how many hours. I've stored all the files there. I've never actually added up how long they go for, but I do the transcribing first, because often when you transcribe, as you're transcribing, the chapter, or the story you're trying to tell comes to mind anyway. So, and once you've got a transcription, even if it's rough and ready in front of you, then it's actually very easy. It's easier then to sort of plot how you want the chapter to work, and you draw different quotes and different people and bring it all together. So I found the transcribing, as dull as it is sometimes, and it's the one time I can't sit at a desk often transcribe. I find transcribing really easy to do on my couch. For some reason, I find it easier than sitting at a desk. I always write at a desk, but sometimes just sitting on the couch with feet on the ottoman, just spread out, is often an easy way to transcribe for some reason. You just got the AirPods and you just sort of click them on and off, go backwards and forwards. But yeah, I haven't worked out how many hours of audio I've got, but I reckon if it was 25 interviews and most of them were minimum 45 minutes to an hour, when you do the maths, that's how many hours of audio I did. And
just a couple of broader ones. Where do you think? Well, there's a big broad question, but where is footy at, and also in your how has footy changed because of this, and B, footy media, how has it changed, and where do you think that's all going forward?
In terms of how the game's changed, well, certainly the mantra of the AFL, flexible and agile, which comes across so often in the book. They've discovered new ways of doing business and operating the competition, and the fixture is the example of that. I mean, I think that probably could have done a little bit more, a bit more flexible and agile with some of the decisions this year, but they've certainly got the scope to move more quickly now than they've had in the past. In terms of the football media, I mean, I write about it in the book. I mean, you across as well, Daniel, is that you don't have to be at the games anymore. I mean, what we learned last year, Daniel, was you can cover football pretty adequately by watching on TV without having to be at games. I mean, so many of the match reports that we read in the papers and online last year were done by people sitting on the couch watching it, and then they would go, instead of going down to the dressing rooms to interview the coaches, they would jump on a Zoom conference and interview the coaches that way, and the players and that sort of thing. So that's probably the big difference from a media point of view. And in terms of the TV and radio, so much of that is now called off the TV. What's happening this year, for people unaware, that in the past, the Fox Footy and the radio station, they would fly to most games. They would jump on a plane in the morning and fly to a game and then fly back afterwards. It cost them a fortune. It was a huge logistical challenge. Well, now we're finding that a lot of them are just driving into a radio studio and calling the game off the TV there. And that's probably it's a contraction of the economy because the broadcasters don't have as much money at their disposal as they did before, and sponsorship money's not quite there. So they're quite happy to contract their operations. That's been the big change, I think, from a football media point of view. And it's been a bit disappointing. I'm not sure the access to players this year hasn't really improved either. I mean, I think I saw you at a game. You can't just walk in the dressing rooms anymore, which often, as a senior writer, and having been in the game for 30 years, I've been able to establish some pretty good relationships with people in the game. And I'm fortunate I can go to most of the dressing rooms and even just stand at the side and talk quietly to people I've known, assistant coaches and football managers and players in some cases, and have just a quiet on background chat to them. And that's disappeared now because you don't have the access to the dressing room. So that's probably changed the way I do things a little bit. And that's probably one thing I'm missing, to be honest, is just the casual conversation with people you've known for a long time. It's not quite the same when you want to pick up the phone and ring someone. You still have those conversations, and I do occasionally with people, but those impromptu conversations, in the side corridor at Marvel Stadium or the MCG, not doing that anymore. It's probably, it gives you a depth and a background to your reporting. You just learn things that you keep up your sleeve. You might use it for 2 months. You're not getting so much of that anymore, which is a bit, it's made our job a little bit harder, I think.
Do you expect we'll be back in the rooms anytime soon?
I wouldn't think this year. The problem is that I follow a bit of American sport. The American sports writers are really anxious that the genie's out of the bottle now, and the clubs are going to say, no, well, we're just not going to let you back in now at all. So as an industry here, the Journalists Association, Australian Football Media Association, needs to make sure that once enough people are vaccinated, that the access to the dressing rooms is allowed again, because it's a really important part of how we do our job. At heart, we're reporters, and to report, you sometimes need to observe, and you can't really observe much from being outside the rooms.
There are a lot of inconsistencies as well, given that we can go to training and stand a metre away from a player at a press conference or at a function. It's not overly consistent. That's a comment. I think we'll go to some questions now. There are quite a few that Joey sent through. So the first one is, did you seek out any writing advice from non-journalist authors in writing the book?
A few people, and I've written books. And I've been in the acknowledgements at the front of the book. A few people who clearly aren't sports writers or sports journalists who either directly or indirectly sort of inspired me and helped me, just some conversations. And even for a couple of people, it was just about lifestyle, just looking after yourself and how to structure your day, that sort of thing. Was helpful for people. Just great encouragement for people who've been there and done that as well. So yeah, a couple of people I would call and say, I'm writing this book. This is an angle I want to pursue. What do you think I should do about this one? But I was pretty clear in the direction I wanted to take the book as well. Once I worked out that I wanted to do sort of that chronological approach to it, I was pretty confident in how I could go about doing it. But it was great to lean on people, just have people occasionally say, yeah, you're doing really well, or, how you're doing this, how you're doing that. And a couple would just pick up the phone and see how I was doing as well, which I really appreciated.
The next one is, what is your advice for aspiring journalists, and what is your advice for aspiring authors?
That's a really good question. Journalism is, I had this conversation with you many years ago, Daniel, as well. Aspiring journalists it's a tough caper to get into. I'm very old school, and people, the path to publishing these days is so easy. And you can start writing nice bits of work on Facebook, and you call yourself technically you're a writer there and then. I cut my teeth doing share market reports for The Age. So getting out of your comfort zone and doing that before I want to turn my attention to sport writing, which is what I always wanted to do. But it's hard. Just write well, get yourself noticed, develop a good social media presence, and you might catch lightning in a bottle. In terms of aspiring authors, again, I'm not sure I could have done it if I was working full time. In fact, I probably wouldn't have done it if I was working full time. I fortunately I had the capacity to do it. But if you've got a story to tell, just find the time to start writing it and then seeing where it takes you. And there'll be, in any field of endeavour, there'll be people who'll be happy to look over it and give you some encouragement. Publishers will always take an idea. Publishers, I've found 2 or 3 I've dealt with, they're always happy to read a chapter and a proposal. So if you've got an idea for a book, write a really good synopsis, write a timeline, and write one chapter, either the first chapter or a key chapter, to the very best of your ability. That's what you need to have if you want to write. If you want a book, you want to get it noticed. That's the approach that I've learned you have to take.
The next one is, do you think that your experience as a sports journalist gave your book a unique writing style?
Well, I certainly wrote it to my style. There's been some great sports books written by people without a sporting background, people who've both here and overseas, and a couple of really good sports books I've read recently are by people who don't have a background in sport. There's fans, and they've taken it to the next level of writing about it. But I think for this book, I think being a sports journalist certainly helped, because one thing is, I was able to ring, the general manager of the Western Bulldogs, the chief executive, who's a bit of a mate, but he took my call, and a couple of people I didn't know very well took my call because they knew my name by reputation. And when I explained the project, they were happy to be involved. So I think I had the advantage of writing it that way. Had someone who wasn't a sports journalist wanted to write this book, I'm not quite sure they would have been able to get access to people that I was able to. But having said that, there'd be 30, 40 of my colleagues, had they gone down that path, who had the same access that I would have, and in a lot of cases probably would have done a super job.
In your opinion, did the experience of writing a book change or develop the way you are as a journalist? Do you think you had to change your approach to interviewing and questioning, and potentially your personality as a writer in comparison to a journalist?
Well, it's a good question. I didn't, because, again, it was almost that matter of time. It was so little time to do it. I knew I had to have it finished pretty much by Christmas. So I said, well, the only way I can get through this is to write it the way I write, and interview the way I interview, and write the way I write it, and go through the same process. As I said, I broke it down to writing. It was 30. I looked upon it as writing 30 feature stories. Feature writing is what I've been doing mainly for the past sort of 8-9 years now. I don't do a lot of news reporting anymore. So I said, the only way I'm going to get through this is I've got to write 30 feature stories between now and Christmas, and that's how that's the approach I'm going to take. The way of some writers have 12 months, 2 years to put their books together, and they can approach it in an entirely different way. And I would love to one day have that luxury of having a lot more time to write a book, to be honest, and try a different approach. But this was the approach that worked best for me in this instance.
Just on that, this is back to me, but you said you at one stage you were setting yourself to write a chapter every 2 days. If you're writing that sort of length feature, how long would that generally take you? How long would you set yourself for one of those chapters if you were writing for the AFL Record, for instance?
Well, it probably takes me. It takes me probably 2 days to write a feature. That's why I was comfortable with time, because it probably takes me 2 days to write a feature. 1 day is, my length at the moment, I'm not writing much more than 1,500 words for a feature. And in the past, we've often had up to 2,500 words for the record, but for various reasons, we've got much tighter for space this year. So probably a day, the equivalent of a day in the interviews and the research and the transcribing. And then a day I can knock over 1,500 words usually. If provided not too many distractions, I can knock over 1,500 word feature usually in a day. It's interesting. This week I've started working on the grand final record features, which are sort of almost a crown jewel for me for the stuff I do for the year. And it's like I've started doing the research. I spent some time today at the AFL doing some research for the first one, and it's going to be a bit old school for me again, writing 2,500 words and 3,000 word features, and having more time to research and more more interviews to do. And I'm looking forward to starting that process as well.
Back to the audience questions. You mentioned the unfortunate news that many football people weren't able to come back to their roles in journalism. Do you think this has impacted the quality of the industry? And do you think it's demotivated prospective sports journalists from exploring careers in the AFL or in journalism?
It's a really good question. Well, there's been a few people who aren't writing anymore, I think are losses to footy writing. A good friend of mine, Ben Collins, one of the great storytellers of football journalism. He's a historian of the game as well. He's not working in the industry anymore, so Ben is a big loss. But there's been a trickle. People we've both worked with, Daniel, over the years aren't doing it anymore, going back sort of 5-10 years as well. There's been a steady contraction for a while, and last year just exacerbated it all. Sorry, what was the second part of the question again?
And do you think it's demotivated prospective sports journalists?
Yeah, well, it has. Some people look at it and say it's just too hard to get into now, which is a bit sad. But it goes back to the earlier question about, by all means, write. And then, write for enjoyment, write for your friends. And then often some people have just got their start in writing just by writing for small circles of friends and acquaintances, and then it goes, and they get noticed, and it goes from there. So if you think in terms of demotivated, it's probably demotivated some. It's just a tough, but media is just tough in general. I mean, it's just a tough industry. And what's happening now is that there's always entry levels, but the remuneration for journalists is another sort of almost a separate discussion as well. That demotivates a lot of people as well. You know, I have the conversation quite regularly with, you know, kids in year 10, 11, 12 who want to be sports journalists. And the first question I ask them is, do you want to work, what's more interesting to you? Is it the sport or is it the journalism? And that's the first honest conversation they've got. First honest question they've got to ask themselves. If it's the sport, then I say, well, listen, there's a lot of other areas in sport you can get into that are really well paid and really, really rewarding. Data, sports science, sports management, sports business, all sorts of areas, high performance, and sports journalism is part of it. If the passion's for journalism, then this is the direction you might want to start thinking about going. But you've got to point out the pitfalls to it as well. There's an industry, like a lot of media, has contracted seriously in the last 15, 20 years. I mean, I was at AFL Media today, my former employer. When AFL Media started in 2012, there were 20 journalists across the country. Now they've got, that's reporters, let alone the editors and the production people. There were 20 of us who were journalists. Now they've got 7. So in 12 years, it's been cut from 20 to 7. And that's happening across the board.
This question is actually directed to both of us, but do you think COVID is now being used as an excuse in the AFL and sport in general? Things that the AFL wanted to do, e.g. fixture blocks, are necessary, but being used, and COVID is being used as an excuse. I'll answer quickly first. I think broadly, yes. I think actually, as much as anything, and this is not just necessarily in sport, but I think there's a lot of cost cutting that's been done in the name of COVID, and financial and management incompetence is being hidden behind that veil. To the AFL's credit, I think, and I actually sort of agree with Ash what he said in terms of Thursday night. Well, I think he was alluding to Thursday night football and some fixed flexibility. I think they probably could be a bit more flexible, and maybe there's not enough Thursday night games. They could be doing them every week. But I actually think the AFL, to their credit, have, despite last year's fixture, which was completely unorthodox and all over the shop, they have tried to revert to things that the public generally got used to, and have tried to revert as much as possible to normal, which I, broadly speaking, admire, because I think it's a good way of getting people back on board and back to normality. But interested to hear your views, Ash. Well,
they use COVID certainly use COVID as a reason for a lot of the decisions they've made. But then the positive decision, so that was the Saturday, it was a 2:30 start to the grand final again this year. And I mean, I'm convinced that until just now, I'm convinced the AFL were going to trial a later start to the grand final as part of this broadcasting agreement, because then it can put a value on the next. They've got some facts on the ground to negotiate the next TV deal. But the AFL is so concerned about just not forcing too much change on people because of COVID, they're keeping the grand finals a day grand final. I think that's one reason, one positive aspect of COVID. But in terms of the bigger picture, I mean, a third of the people have left the industry, which roughly means a third of the money has left the industry. The crowds at the moment are 2/3 of what they were. So you've got to look at it. There's been a 33% cut in everything in the AFL as a result of COVID. So that's going to affect a lot of the decisions that are made. Now, people might think in terms of football operations and football costs, they probably cut to, and I think you reported this, Daniel, that there's a real feeling in the industry they cut too much. You know, the soft cap, which is all the money they can spend on football expenditure other than player salaries, gone from, 9.7 to 6.2 or something million. People say that's too harsh. Now, I'm not sure. I don't have a real opinion on that. But that gives you an indication of the scope of how the industry is operating these days, and affects every decision they made. I mean, any business will be like that. If you've lost a third of your revenue, then you're going to have to make some serious changes to the way you operate.
You mentioned briefly the toll you saw on players as a result of the unpredictable nature of the season. Do you think the mental health of players and those involved in the industry was treated as seriously as it could have been?
Well, the AFL, no, I'll tell you, the AFL treated very seriously. The AFL sort of fortunately decided in 2019 to beef up its mental health department, or department's the right word, but they brought in 2 specialists headed by Dr. Kate Hall to be head of mental health at the AFL. Then when the pandemic kicked in last year, they pretty much mobilised a whole big team of mental health experts to go into the hubs and to work with the players and work with the industry. What they discovered was, and I touched on this in the book a little bit, is that the players, by and large, the players dealt with it better than they thought, because in a lot of cases, particularly for the younger players, ones who weren't attached, spending 3 months living in Queensland with your 30 or 40 of your best mates was heaven on earth. I mean, they had a ball. And the stress in mental health in footy last year came from a lot of the senior people in the game. So you had people managing the win-loss cycle that happens at a footy club every week. We're talking about chief executives and heads of football and coaches and that sort of thing. So they're managing the weekly win-loss cycle, and that has a tremendous effect on a footy club whether you win or lose every week. They had to cut 30% of the stuff. These staff cuts didn't happen after the season. These staff cuts happened during the season. So they had to let a third of their staff go over the course of the season. A lot of these people had moved interstate with a team and then were told, okay, you can't stay with us after the season, or if you want to leave now, whatever. So they had they were running these, $50, $60 million businesses remotely away from their families. So what they find, they're making these huge decisions during the day and managing these huge teams of people who've been relocated that get back to their hotel rooms at night, jump on Zoom like this, and then dealing with their family situation. And you're talking about football. A lot of young families travel to the hubs, Daniel, but a lot of the older people in football that we're talking about, got older kids in high school. They weren't going to the hubs. You had people leaving their kids doing VCE. You had people leaving their wives who had full-time jobs. They were managing the home life and their older kids while their husbands were in the hubs, in the hub scenario. And that's where the mental health issues came in. So you had people working 40, 50, 60 days straight with no respite, managing a footy operation, a footy club during the day, and dealing with their family issues in the evening. And there was a lot of burnout, stress, and exhaustion. We've seen 3 marriage breakups, partly with various degrees attributable to the hubs of senior coaches. It was estimated by the AFL that the full toll in terms of mental health of the hubs and the pandemic season won't be felt until probably the middle of this year. And I'm not sure how much that will get reported down the track, but that was what the AFL was concerned about. So I think they actually prepared very well, but they managed on the spot and soon came to the realisation it was the senior people in the game, perhaps more than the players, who needed help.
Just mindful of time, we've got a few more questions. You mentioned that you'd like more time to write another book one day. What kind of book would you like to write?
Well, the problem is, you write one book, you get the taste for it on, so I'm already busting to write another one. So I'm throwing in a few ideas at the moment. Publisher have approached me after thinking about writing one particular book that I'm 5 times more complicated than one I've just written, but I have to think about whether I've got capacity. But I'd really like to do another book at one stage. Now, next step would be the idea. I mean, this was an idea someone gave to me to write. The next step would be to write a book that was sort of, I conceived the idea myself. So I'm throwing over a couple of ideas in my mind at the moment. I've got a bit of time at the end of the year, hopefully, to sort of lay out a couple of ideas and see whether they'll float.
Would it be a footy book or a sport book?
Well, one I've been approached about is a non-sports book, and the other book that I'm trying to see where there's a footy book that I could write, and I'm sort of got 2 or 3 ideas percolating at the moment. But that'd be a long way off anything happening at this stage. But I'd like to do another one. But again, if I'm working close to full time, then I've got to decide whether I've got the capacity to do it.
Just a few more to get through. Who is your favourite personality in the industry?
Oh, that's I don't really have people I enjoy. There's a lot of people I enjoy talking to. In terms of my all-time favourite, I think, and this is coming from a Hawthorn person, it's going to upset any Hawthorn people, but my favourite person for is probably Kevin Sheedy, who I've never failed to be entertained by, to learn something from. To spend any time spent with Sheeds is a privilege and a joy. So he's probably my favourite football personality.
When did you know you wanted to be a sports journalist?
I probably wanted to be a sports journalist when I was from the age of 10, but it took me far too long to actually realise it. I had opportunities to do it early when I finished school, and I didn't pursue it. Other bit of advice is don't listen to careers counsellors, because my career counsellor at school told me I should be an accountant. So I started going down that path when I left school without realising that one should always follow one's heart, and I should have pursued sports journalism from when I left school.
And how would you rank the AFL's survival through COVID-19 in relation to other sports industries?
The AFL has done a magnificent job, and you compare, and I think the NRL goes in the same boat. I think that NRL, as the figureheads of Australian sport, and I'm interested in your views, Daniel, if we've got time, the AFL and the NRL stand head and shoulders above any other Australian sport. And I would suggest in world sport, you look at the carnage and how the NFL season, the NBA season was played, and European soccer. What the AFL got right, one player tested positive, and they were able to get the season away, thinking they had to think laterally and think on their feet, but they got things done. The NBA headhunted the AFL's head of corona protocols, a really good guy, you probably know, Pat Clifton, really good guy. He was headhunted by the NBA, one of the powerful leagues in the world, because they couldn't get it right, and they looked at the AFL doing it properly, and they went and got their guy and shipped him over to New York to get them sorted out. So that speaks volumes of how well the AFL managed during the pandemic.
Yeah, I broadly agree. I mean, I think the AFL and NRL benefited as much as anything from the fact that they're in Australia, and the COVID situation here was just generally, leave Victoria to one side, I suppose, but was handled very well. I also covered cricket, and I thought cricket initially panicked and made decisions that weren't optimal and probably cut too deeply early and caused unnecessary angst. But actually, in the end, they did do very well to get through their home summer and a big bash league season where you're dealing with pretty much every state's border shut at some point, or there were changes there. So, but I think I agree. The AFL overall did very well, and the one thing I think they probably could have done better in hindsight was get an AFLW Premier at some point last year. I think that's one thing that
and that was something Gil said was one regret. I asked him what was one thing you wish you did differently. He said we should sort of somehow played an AFLW grand final. They gambled with the time, and they ran out of time. But they were, in hindsight, not having a premier last year for AFLW was a major oversight.
It'll always be, I suppose it'll always be, when you look through the honour roll, it'll always be a great reminder of the challenges of last year. No, thanks so much, Ashley. I think you've answered all that in a very detailed manner and well as you'd expect. So thanks so much, and I'll pass it back to, was it Ian, I think?
Yeah. Look, thank you very much, both Daniel and Ashley. I've been sitting here rather spellbound by this whole thing. I have to admit I'm not normally a football follower. I'll leave that to other members of my family. But I've been fascinated by what's happened last year in particular. In fact, last year almost appears to be a bit of a blur now with lockdowns and everything else. But to hear the way that the AFL got through, to me, is testimony to the fortitude of the whole game and the way that the AFL works. And actually, your writing is legendary. Whilst, Daniel, you might be slightly newer on the block, I think the book that you've written is going to be a must read for not only football fans, but for people, sociologists, who are interested in what happened in 2020. With that, I want to thank you both for a fascinating hour this evening on behalf of the Lamb Jewish Library of Australia. As Lauren said earlier, the Lamb Jewish Library of Australia is probably the premier resource of the Jewish community in Australia, with its collections and the way that it links up with various other organisations. I have to put in a plug. We rely very heavily, almost entirely, on donations from the community to keep the doors open. Last year, of course, the whole situation dug a very big hole for us, which we need to fill so that we can keep the doors open and keep having events, not only like this, but other events, and allow the community to use the library as the resource that it is and should be for the future. So with those words, I thank you both. I thank the audience for its questions, and wish you all a good night.
Thanks very much, Ian. Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
everyone for joining us.
Thank you.